Detective Recap here. Today, I'm going to explain a drama thriller film called Funny Games. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. George and Ann Farber have decided to spend some time at their lake house with their son, Georgie, and dog, Lucky. With their boat in tow, the family heads to their vacation home with smiles on their faces. As they near their property, the Farbers stop by their neighbor Fred's house, asking if he's joining them for golf the following day. Fred, who is with his wife and two young men, says he will. Ann then asks if he could give them a hand launching their boat into the water, and Fred says he'll meet them in 20 minutes. When the Farbers drive away, Ann wonders why Fred seemed different and who the men with him were. Georgie then asks where his friend Jenny is, and his mother tells him that she's probably at the beach. When George suggests that the men may be Fred's relatives, Ann drops the subject. When they reach their house, Ann instructs her son to take his stuff to his room. George enters the house with his golf clubs, and the family settles in. Ann tells her husband to take Lucky with him outside, and when he does, George finds Fred and one of the men from his house standing by the gate. As they get in, George apologizes for their dog's behavior, but the guests don't seem to mind. Fred introduces Paul to George as the son of one of his business associates. Ann then calls Lucky, who won't stop barking at Paul, before greeting Fred and asking him how Eve is. Though he's a bit anxious, Fred says he's fine, and Ann greets Paul, too. As the men launch the boat into the water, Georgie expresses his disappointment that Jenny isn't with them. Georgie is upset because Jenny has promised to be there with him, but George doesn't know what to say to his son. In an attempt to comfort him, George promises that they will ask Jenny's mother about her the next day. Letting it go, Georgie asks his father why Fred is acting strange. Meanwhile, in the kitchen, Ann is talking to her friend, Nancy, on the phone. As she does, Georgie comes in and asks for a sharp knife, immediately leaving after Ann gives it to him. Ann then resumes her conversation with her friend, urging her to drop by their lake house. When Georgie comes back, she tells Nancy to call her if ever she decides to come over. Ann asks Georgie why he's back, and the boy informs her that they have a visitor. Ann goes to the door to see who it is, and she finds the other man from Fred's house, Peter. She then lets him in, asking what he needs, and Peter shyly asks for eggs. He says that Eve sent him over to see if Ann could give her some. Without hesitation, Ann prepares the eggs then asks Peter how he got inside their property. Peter says he got in down by the water, and when Ann points out that he's not wet, he adds that he went through the hole by the fence. Not giving it much thought, Ann gives Peter the eggs and asks him to give her regards to Eve. However, Peter drops the eggs when he's about to leave, and while Ann goes back to the kitchen to get some towels for the mess, Peter keeps looking around the house. Peter apologizes to Ann as she cleans the floor before casually asking for 4 more eggs. Trying to be nice, Ann prepares the other 4 eggs for Peter, and as she does, Peter discreetly but purposely drops the house phone in the sink. Ann quickly takes it out of the water, and despite her irritation, she just politely asks Peter to leave. Ann relaxes a little once Peter is gone, but when she hears Lucky furiously barking outside, she decides to check it out. She then discovers that Lucky is barking at Peter and Paul, who are still inside their house. She apologizes to the young men, asking them if they're hurt, and Peter claims that Lucky jumped on him. Embarrassed, Ann asks if they want her to lock Lucky up so they can leave, but Paul assures her it won't be necessary. He then notices George's golf clubs, and when he asks Ann if he can try using one outside, Ann reluctantly lets him. Outside, George and Georgie both wonder why Lucky keeps on barking, shouting at the dog to keep quiet. When the dog finally stops making noise, George decides to take a look, unknowingly dropping Georgie's borrowed knife on the boat. When Ann goes outside to look for Lucky, she bumps into Paul, who thanks her for letting him use the club. As Ann is about to return to the house, Paul asks her if she's given the eggs to Tom, confusing her. Paul then goes back to the Farbers' house without invitation, and when Ann gets inside, she tells the strangers to leave her out of their game. Playing dumb, Paul asks Ann what game she's talking about and if they've done something to upset her. Fed up, Ann ignores his question and tells them to leave, but the guests insist on having the eggs first. Taken aback by their audacity, she grabs Peter by the arm just to make him leave. When George finally arrives and asks what's happening, Peter and Paul explain why they're there and what they want, making Ann seem like the bad guy. Georgie then arrives, too, and witnesses the whole thing. To end the argument with the guests, Ann retrieves 4 more eggs from the kitchen and asks George to give them to the men. Instead of just handing the eggs to Paul, George asks her why she's so upset, but Ann won't justify herself in front of the strangers. When she finally goes into another room, George apologizes to Peter and Paul and nicely asks them to leave. But again, the men are insistent on getting the eggs first. Paul then insults George, prompting George to slap the rude man. In retaliation, Peter hits George in the legs with a golf club. Georgie rushes to his father's side as he collapses on the floor before attacking the strangers. But of course, he hardly causes them any harm. Paul easily pins the kid to the floor, asking him to behave himself before he gets hurt. When Ann comes out of the room and sees George down, Paul explains that her husband slapped him. Ann and Georgie then tend to George, and as they help him sit on a chair, Paul insists on having Peter check his leg since he's a medical student. However, George just wants them gone, and when Paul says neither he nor Tom will stop them from calling an ambulance or the cops, Ann informs her husband that Peter dropped the phone in the sink. Georgie is crying at this point, and George demands to know why these strangers are tormenting them, to which Paul announces that they'll be playing a guessing game. He then shows them a golf ball, asking them why he has it. When the family doesn't answer, Peter says Paul didn't get to hit it because something stopped him. Proud of his friend's correct answer, Paul arrogantly tells them he had to use the club on something else, making Anne realize that he killed Lucky. Outside, Paul guides Anne as she looks for Lucky, giving her hints so she'll quickly find him. When Anne approaches their car, Paul looks at his imaginary audience and smiles before giving Anne more clues about Lucky's location. Finally, Anne opens the car and gasps when Lucky's body falls to the ground. Suddenly, Anne's friends arrive at the dock, and Paul tells her not to alert them. Anne then greets Betsy and Robert, and Betsy introduces her sister-in-law to Anne. Anne introduces Paul to them, too, saying he's staying with their neighbors, and when Betsy asks about George, Anne lies and says he's resting after pulling a muscle from putting up the mast. As Anne's friends are about to leave, Paul asks them where their dock is, and after Betsy tells him where, she bids them goodbye. Back at the house, Peter asks Georgie to get him some food from the kitchen, warning him not to try anything funny. When Anne and Paul return, Anne tells them their friends are coming over in 2 hours, but Peter doesn't believe her, saying he heard her conversation with Nancy in the kitchen. Anne and Georgie then help George to the couch, and when Peter and Paul continue hounding them, Anne begs them to stop. Pleased with Anne's politeness, Paul apologizes to George for his behavior as Anne leaves the room to get some painkillers. He then properly introduces himself and Peter to George. But George ignores them, so when Anne returns to give him some medicine, Peter shoves her to the couch. With Anne landing on his hurt body, George cries in pain. Furious, Anne tries attacking Paul, but he easily subdues her by punching her in the gut while Peter steps on George's leg. Georgie tries fighting back, too, but Paul warns him to stop, threatening to hurt Anne if he doesn't. When everybody finally calms down, George asks the strangers again why they're tormenting them. Turning to his friend, Paul tells Peter to answer George's question, but Peter starts getting emotional and cries. Tired of Peter's drama, Paul tells everyone that Peter is the way he is because his mother divorced his father when he was just a boy. Upset, Peter says Paul is lying, but Paul keeps talking about Peter's past, enjoying seeing his friend in pain. As Paul continues using profanities, George asks him to stop for his son's sake. Paul then complies, saying that none of what he just said is even true. He then chuckles when Peter finally smiles. As the Farbers cry on the couch, Peter goes to the kitchen to find something to eat. Paul then claims that he and Peter are drug addicts who like to rob wealthy families in their vacation homes to support their habit. Paul asks Peter for the time as he returns from the kitchen with snacks, and when Peter tells him it's already past 8, Paul announces that they will have a bet. He tells the Farbers to bet that they will still be alive after 12 hours, while he and Peter will bet that they'll be dead. Confused, Anne looks to her husband, who is equally befuddled. Paul then looks to the imaginary camera and talks to the imaginary audience, asking them if they think the Farbers stand a chance. Tired and hurt, George tells them to just get their money and leave, saying Fred and Eve will eventually come over to check on them. However, Paul completely ignores him, while Peter asks Anne to cook some food for them. Irritated, Paul tells him to watch his weight, and Peter gets offended, telling Paul to stop making fun of his body. Their attention then shifts to Anne's body, and when she gets offended, she tries to walk out of the room. Georgie attempts to do the same, but Peter grabs him. Paul asks for his name, and when the boy answers, Paul announces that they'll play another game. Anne protests, but Paul ignores her and puts a pillowcase over Georgie's head. Peter grabs Anne as she tries to stop them, and while Georgie struggles to break free from him, Paul assures them that nothing bad will happen to the kid. To start the game, Paul tells Anne to undress for them, but when she doesn't, Paul bends one of Georgie's fingers, making the boy scream. George begs Paul to stop, but Paul only continues to hurt Georgie. Paul then orders George to get his wife to undress, and with no other choice, George tells Anne to remove her clothes. While the strangers watch, Anne cries as she takes her clothes off. Once Anne is completely unclothed, Paul compliments her for being fit before asking her to get dressed again. Humiliated, Anne does as she's told, while Paul tells Peter to take Georgie to the bathroom after the kid peed in his pants. As Peter is about to take Georgie away, Anne and George attack the men, giving the boy a chance to run away. Georgie goes upstairs and escapes through the balcony while Peter and Paul are binding his parents. Paul then leaves to find Georgie, who tries and fails to climb over the gate. Georgie waddles through the waters and goes to Fred's house, then immediately hides inside once he sees Paul coming. When Georgie notices the water trail he's left on the floor, he quickly removes his shoes and pants to avoid being followed. Georgie then hides in one of the rooms, where he notices a gun in the hallway. As he is about to get it, he sees a dead body lying on the bathroom floor, causing him to panic and hide again. However, he returns to the hallway to retrieve the gun before finally going back into hiding. When Georgie decides to leave the room, he unluckily comes face to face with Paul in the hallway. Georgie begs him not to go near him, but Paul just calmly instructs Georgie to cock the gun while walking toward him. Scared, Georgie points the gun at Paul, and when Paul tells him to pull the trigger, the boy obeys. Unfortunately, the gun is not loaded, leaving Georgie in more trouble. Meanwhile, with Peter briefly leaving the room, Anne hops over to George to get her husband to unbind her. Unfortunately, Peter quickly returns and stops them, dropping the carton of eggs in the process. Trying her luck, Anne begs Peter to let them go, but the young man won't listen to her and says she's only degrading herself. When Paul and Georgie return, the kid tells his mother that Jenny is dead. As Paul gives Fred's hunting rifle to Peter, he informs Georgie's parents that their son tried to kill him. Paul then asks Peter what time it is, and when Peter says it's already after 11, Paul suggests they resume their game. After they load the gun, Paul starts choosing who among the Farbers they will shoot first, leaving the poor family in tears. Unable to decide, Paul goes to the kitchen to fix himself a sandwich, while Peter continues to select which of the three he'll kill. The gun suddenly goes off while Paul is preparing his food, but he just ignores it and continues what he's doing. The couple screams then follow the sound, and when Paul returns to the living room, he scolds Peter for not following the rules and shooting the wrong person. However, Peter argues that the person he shot tried to run away, but Paul is having none of it. After learning that it's almost midnight, Paul decides that it's time for them to leave, and he casually tells them to have a nice evening. Once the intruders leave, neither George nor Anne moves. Eventually, Anne gets to her senses, so she hops around the house to turn off the television. As Anne kneels on the floor, she avoids looking at her son's dead body. She tells George that the intruders are gone, but he doesn't answer her. Anne makes her way to the kitchen by hopping and manages to unbind herself before returning to the living room with a knife. George weeps, and though Anne is comforting him, she encourages him to get himself together before the men come back. Despite his pain, George lets Anne help him get up, only to realize that they're locked inside the house. Frustrated, George tells Anne to just leave him since he's dead weight, but Anne opposes, saying the gate is probably locked, too. Realizing his wife might be right, George instructs Anne to get the pliers and cut through the fence, reminding her to be careful. He then tells her to get dressed, and as Anne puts on her clothes, George informs her he'll hide in the cellar and wait for her to come back. Before leaving, Anne realizes that her phone is already getting a signal, but she fails to make a call. With George's phone in the car, Anne desperately tries to make hers work by wiping it with a towel before deciding to use a hairdryer on it. When George informs her that the phone still isn't working, Anne suddenly throws up, making George feel bad. After cleaning herself, Anne tries with the hairdryer again. With the attempt still ending in a failure, George tells her not to waste any more time. He asks Anne to help move him further into the kitchen, and after that, Anne prepares to leave. George asks for Anne's forgiveness before she goes, but Anne only cries and kisses George, telling him how much she loves him. As Anne cuts her way through the fence, she tries screaming for help, but nobody hears her. She then walks on the road, and when she sees a car approaching her, Anne decides to hide behind a tree. When she sees the vehicle that has just passed isn't the intruders, Anne tries calling it back for help, but the car is already too far away. However, it isn't long when another car shows up. Meanwhile, George finally manages to call 911, but the operator can't understand him. Realizing that it's just useless, George gives up on his second attempt to make a call. He then goes to the living room to put a blanket over Georgie's dead body, and when he's about to sit, he notices a golf ball rolling on the floor. Peter and Paul return with Anne, who is once again bound and gagged. After beating up George and learning that he has managed to call 911, Paul reminds Peter to shoot the right person in their next game. Paul then removes Anne's gag and tells her the rules of their new game, but George instructs his wife not to cooperate and just let the men do whatever they want with them. Annoyed, Paul asks the audience if they think the Farbers have already had enough, only to proceed with the game anyway. Paul wants Anne to decide which person will die next and whether that person will die by a gun or knife. When Anne doesn't answer, Paul orders Peter to hurt George, pushing Anne to spit at Paul. Crying, Anne asks Paul what to do, and the young man tells her to say a prayer. However, Anne doesn't know any prayers, so Paul asks Peter to teach her one. When Paul repeats the prayer to Anne and asks her to kneel, Anne finally recites the short prayer while sobbing. Impressed, Paul asks Anne to say the prayer backwards, but Anne sees an opportunity to grab the gun. She immediately shoots Peter, leaving Paul to scream as his friend gets shot. He then takes the gun from Anne before hitting her with it. Paul frantically searches the living room for the remote control, and upon finding it, he presses the rewind button. He fully breaks the fourth wall with this, and they go back in time to prevent Peter's death. Back to when Anne attempts to grab the gun, Paul easily gets it first. He's annoyed now that Anne broke the rules, so he shoots George without remorse. The next day, Peter and Paul take Anne to the boat, where she remains bound and gagged. Once they sail, Anne notices the knife that George has dropped earlier and tries to cut herself free. Unfortunately, the men quickly notice what she's doing, and Peter takes the knife away from her before tossing it away. He then helps Anne sit between him and Paul, and as he talks about being inside a black hole, Paul asks him for the time. When Peter tells him it's already after 8, Paul kisses Anne before casually pushing her overboard. Surprised, Peter asks why Paul did it since Anne still has some time left, and Paul just chuckles, saying he's getting hungry. The intruders then sail to Betsy's place, where Paul tells Betsy that Anne has sent him, and he reminds her that they met the previous day. Paul then asks Betsy for eggs, saying that Anne needs them, and the clueless woman lets him inside the house. As Betsy goes to the kitchen to get the eggs, Paul looks around the house before creepily staring into the camera. Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.